So I feel very quite a large amount of discomfort in the sort of from the EDI side, because I'm of that pale, stale male demographic, and I'd rather free up the space for others to talk. And moreover, I am certainly not a ChatGPT expert. So what you're going to hear are some observations from a rank and file academic about various aspects of EDI and various aspects of AI. And it's more a question of sort of raising some points for discussion rather than me having any answers. By the way, quite a few of these slides were AI generated. It's a wonderful, you're probably aware of this, it's a wonderful little AI feature in PowerPoint now, which is a designer thing. By typing some words into that and see what it generates, isn't it? So one of the slides I've got is languages. What's really about how ChatGPT can help with languages. When you type in languages and see what it generates, all computer languages. Nothing to do with any sort of our human languages. Or AI overlords are coming. So yeah, as you can see, fairly broad: physics, diversity, and artificial intelligence. Let's first of all step beyond preaching to the converted. Can you go to the next slide? Let's just be aware of this. Not everybody enthusiastically supports EDI initiatives. Next slide, please, Olga. This is just 2 weeks ago, or about a week ago, June the 28th. I'm a victim of anti-male bias in science. This was at one of these Lindau Nobel laureate meetings, and won the Nobel Prize, Kurt Wüthrich, in 2002 for NMR of different biomolecules, and basically saying that we're now at a point where males are being discriminated against. Peter Coles, my erstwhile colleague from Nottingham, who's an astronomer, cosmologist, he's now in Maynooth. He's got a wonderful blog, which I point you towards. This is a great talk. Gave a talk at the Lindau meeting last week, during which he claimed that there was anti-male discrimination in modern science. I've uncovered further relevant evidence. Here's a picture of 4 old white men from the same meeting being discriminated against by being forced to participate in a panel consisting entirely of white men. Next one, same issue, or same time and times higher. This Lindau meeting, there seems to be an awful lot of people with axes to grind. Diversity not essential for research excellence. This is Germany's only female Nobel Prize winner. You can see many scientists are very focused on their own research and do not care about their surroundings. There are many examples of scientists who do not interact much and do not need this diversity. So there's kickback, and it's not the thing I'm concerned about is obviously sort of this backlash, but it's also backlash among students. And I'll show you some slides that we need to be conscious of. Appreciate that we're all of a particular mindset within this room, and I think we also got a little bit too comfortable, you know, a few years back, thinking, well, there's no way Trump is ever going to get in. All you needed to do was look at some of the comment sections under YouTube videos, which is generally not a good thing to do. But if you want to get a flavour of the political tone, where everybody's anonymous and just firing things out, that's the way to go. Next slide, please, Olga. There's quite a few of these. Just stepping back a few years, this guy, Strumi, I don't know, show of hands, do many of you remember this guy? Stood up at CERN in a workshop on diversity to basically say physics was built by men. Men are, in terms of the diversity of their skills and abilities, are at the very top end and at the very bottom end, and therefore, because physics is so intellectually challenging, that makes men so much more suited to physics, which was the general point. Data doesn't lie, women don't like physics. So why am I bringing them up? Next slide, please. So I had quite a long discussion with Alessandro. And one thing that comes back out time and time again is that they claim that diversity initiatives are always about victimhood. Yet his language is of the victim time and time again, that males are being discriminated against. And we had a long to and fro, and many of others colleagues, which I'll get to in a second, also had a back and forth with Alessandro. There were articles in the Times. I love this. I wrote a letter to the Times at one point. This was what I got in response. I'm only disappointed it isn't written in green ink. That's the type that has to be written in green ink. But you can say, women do not have the mental equipment necessary for top-class research in physics. It's online. You can chase it up if you want. I'm happy to provide the link. But I love this last time, and I hope you are now thoroughly ashamed of yourself for challenging this. Next slide, please. Thanks, Olga. So we spent quite a bit of time. There are a few people on here whose names you might recognize. It was Erin who really drove a lot of this. I guess many of you will know Jess Wade. If you don't, go look up Jess Wade. She's waged a one-woman war on Wikipedia to increase the number of wiki pages on female physicists and female scientists. She's just a powerhouse. She's brilliant. So we had a back and forth with Alessandro in terms of a more academic forum. Let's put it that way. If you're interested, you can have a look. Next slide, please, Olga. This is what I was alluding to earlier, and this is what I'm very conscious about. I have 2 teenage daughters and a teenage son. And a study by Savanta on this is really recent, January 2023, on 1,600 UK university students revealed that over a quarter of male students think that universities do too much when trying to tackle misogyny. There's a backlash, and some of that is the teenage backlash. We kick back against our parents. Next slide, please. You familiar with this guy? Right. If you're not familiar with this guy and you're teaching undergraduates, get familiar with this guy very soon. A guy called Andrew Tate. So you can chase up some of those headlines. If you type his name and you'll find lots of really, really horrendous stuff. But I certainly encountered undergrads who are, if not complimentary about Tate, certainly don't fully dismiss his views. Let's put it that way. So next slide, please. And this is the thing that's always, this is actually one of the key points I want to get across in this first part. I will get on to ChatGPT as advertised, I promise. But just across the way from my office and from Olga's office in the George Green Library, we have a Starbucks. And on the wall of Starbucks, we have this. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And we all get a warm, fuzzy feeling when we read that as academics. But that's really not the problem here in many cases. Take climate change, for example. There are many people, very intelligent people, who reject climate change. And this idea that all we need to do is educate, 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 I think is flawed. It's more about community. It's more about making links. It's more about being inclusive in a broader sense, but obviously tackling this type of nonsense. Next one, please. Not least, we are often seen as the enemy in communities outside our own. We're talking about inclusivity. We're talking about reaching out to communities beyond the university, the rather cosseted university, hallowed ivory towers, whatever cliches we want to use. Pew Research Center poll last month found that and I know this is US, 38% of American adults think universities are having a negative impact on the country. Next slide, please. That was 2019. Just last year, it's gone up. So the effect of colleges and universities on the country and local communities is positive versus negative. That's up from 37 or whatever it was, 38%. That's an awful lot of people that think we don't do good in the world. And we need to think of, when we're going out, reaching out to other communities, we need to think about this. Next slide, please, Olga. Okay, finally onto the ChatGPT thing. Next one. So these Nottingham were very lucky to work with these guys. This guy in particular, Brady Harron, is a BBC video journalist. Started working with Nottingham back in 2009 on a project called 60 Symbols, and it's a YouTube channel. And Brady has a ton of these YouTube channels now. His most popular is something called Numberphile. You can probably guess what that's about, which has, I guess at this stage, close to 5 million subscribers, something like this. So he's got quite a lot of reach and quite a lot of impact. And they involve basically taking academics, short YouTube videos to try and put across key concepts in physics, but also we've explored a range of different things, including ChatGPT. And this is the reason I got invited to do this, despite my misgivings, is that Olga was aware of this video. Now, ChatGPT is really intriguing. So we made this video back in January, and I'm pointing out that it gets quite a lot of physics wrong. If we go to the next slide, barely a few more, I think this is now going to go April, so 3 months later. Next slide. This is on the archive at the moment. Advances in apparent conceptual physics reasoning in GPT-4. So GPT-4 is the next step onwards from ChatGPT. ChatGPT was GPT 3.5. These large language models, what's amazing is these are language models. And the thing that I was railing against for ChatGPT in terms of it not being able to connect the dots and put the concepts together, there's something called, which any of you involved in physics education will be familiar with this, the force concept inventory. And they basically set GPT-4 on this, and it on its first attempt, because the thing with these models, so these chatbots, is that you can just keep answering them, asking them the questions in slightly different ways and pushing them towards the answer. But on its first attempt, got 28 out of 30, which places it here in terms of the percentiles and the number of students in each other category. It's at the top end, as they say in the abstract. So sponsors come quite close to perfectly demonstrating expert level competence. This changes everything in terms of education. So standard traditional exams, standard assessment methods, we really have to think about carefully how we're going to use those. And the final paragraph of this paper is great. I think this is the key point. Ultimately, perhaps what is most intriguing is what GPT-4 may tells us. Okay, sort of got GPT-4 to proofread it. It may tell us not about the future of our classrooms, but about our future conceptions of physics as a discipline. Because if this thing can solve the type of physics questions that we were asked and did exams on as undergraduates, why are we training our students to answer those questions? We should be using this as a tool, and I certainly use it now all the time, and there's something called Copilot, which is the GitHub, the coding equivalent to ChatGPT. And instead of me going, right, okay, I've got a 3D or 4D array, I want to section it so I get this row and this column or this vector out. How the hell do I do that? ChatGPT, how do I do that? Bingo, and the code's there. Is that something we don't expect our students to do? Because I'm certainly going to do that because it's a massive time saver. Next slide, please, Olga. So before that, sorry, a couple of years before that, we had something called another video, which myself and a colleague, Mike Merrifield, who's an astronomer in physics here, we had a discussion about whether the lecture should continue. This was in the context of lockdowns, pandemic, etc., etc. I will have, no bones about it. I hate lectures. I think the idea of us standing up in front and me doing what I'm doing now, talking at students for 50 minutes is archaic, and I don't think it's a good way to educate. But it's easy. It's really easy for the students, and it's really easy for us. And I also know that if I want to get good scores when it comes to student evaluation and teaching, what do? I entertain. I'm the embodiment of YouTube culture in terms of what it's about, making the science exciting. It's about making the science accessible, and those are good things to do. And it's about enthusing them. That's another good thing to do. But is that education? How much are they learning, and how much more could they be learning with more active approaches? The other thing, and I'm coming on right on the back of the previous discussion, is indeed when it comes to neurodiverse students, this video has something like, it's really well worth, forget about watching the video itself. Oh, and by the way, I love these. These are ostensibly, these quotes are from Virginia Woolf. I think it might be apocryphal, but university lectures were an obsolete practice inherited from the Middle Ages when books were scarce. To swallow instruction from a lecturer is like sipping through a straw. Lectures pander to the vanity of the lecturer. Indeed. There's nothing academics like more, including myself, than the sound of their own voice. So what you say, the Open University is 50 years ahead of these people, dead right. Interview someone from the OU, exactly, we should. And as someone with dyslexia, studying online worked really well, now studying with masters. There's also, as a student on the autism spectrum, online classes are essential. The best lectures in the world on any topic can be available on YouTube. Questions can be asked in online discussion boards. What the universities are afraid of is that everyone will eventually realise that universities are no longer needed for education, except for hands-on lab work, 73 upvotes. So there's a lot to consider here, and this is, I really wish the pandemic had been a sea change in terms of lecturing, but I can see what's happening. We can probably all see what's happening. We're going back to the standard 50-minute talk at them. The because that's the easiest thing in the world to do. Next slide, please, Olga. And it's also what students prefer. It's not the best thing for them, but it's what they prefer. Measuring actual learning versus feeling of learning in response to being actively engaged in the classroom, PNAS paper from a few years back. Students in active classrooms learned more, as would be expected based on prior research, but their perception of learning, while positive, was lower than that of their peers in passive environments. Again, if you want to push up your student evaluation, teaching and scores, the last thing you want to do is do anything off the tried and trusted talk at them for 15 minutes. Okay, next slide. Moreover, this is from 10 years ago in the Times. Sorry, this was an interesting paper. As with anything in the psychology literature, you do have to worry about the reproducibility, but this was quite a large study. But the point they're making here is that students can feel enthused, can feel they've learned a lot. And the more enthusiasm you put in, the better, of course, in terms of engaging them. But does that mean they're learning? This particular study found no. Okay. Right. So, and the arguments under that YouTube video is there's time and time again, if you just take a sampling of the comments, if you visit it and take a sampling of the comments, it's like, well, I was lectured to 30 years ago and it didn't do me any harm. Think about quantum mechanics. So if you just repeatedly hit the down key, common misconceptions, framing difficulties, overcoming misconceptions, student misconceptions, assessing and improving student understanding. This is all the legacy of standard quantum mechanics lecturing. It's clearly not going in. So couldn't we do something a little bit different? Next slide, Olga. I was going to run a little simulation, but I haven't got time. It's fine. If you want to, just Google that, it'll probably bring you to this particular simulation. And what this is, one thing students really, really struggle with is if I've got a quantum state that's evolving and I make a measurement of energy or I make a measurement of position or I make a measurement of momentum, what happens? And so I can spend many, many lectures. You can spend many, many lectures getting that, trying to get that across. But why not let's get them to sit down and first of all, play with a simulation that shows them so they can measure energy or position, momentum, and watch how it evolves. Set up a series of questions based around that. Get ChatGPT to help you with those questions. Get ChatGPT to actually help you code the damn thing. I wish it had been around when I coded this. I spent about 8 hours of JavaScript playing around with this, and I could have done that in a fraction of the time if ChatGPT were there. And then the next step is, well, in terms of assessing our students, given that ChatGPT is out there and any of the traditional questions, it's pretty much going to be able to solve. We've seen with GPT-4, it's scoring really highly. Why not get the students to ask ChatGPT to develop something like this? And is it getting the physics correct? How do you know is it getting the physics correct? You get them to develop something which is a resource for the years below them or indeed for their peers. And then we are telling them, let's use ChatGPT, let's use these type of AI resources to actually do something. And that's the way we're going. We can dig our heels in the sand and complain about this. We can try and ban it. It's not going to work because the computer scientists are now talking about the future of coding being prompt engineering, whereby you engineer the right prompts to get the code you want out of a particular AI. Next slide, please, Olga. 2 days ago, UK universities draw up guiding principles on generative AI. All 24 Russell Group universities have reviewed their academic conduct policies and guidance. This is quite intelligent what's happened here. It's not a sort of let's ban this outright. It really is a question of trying to bring AI into our assessment procedures, into our teaching procedures, and to really exploit this resource. Okay, and I am getting to the neurodiverse side, I promise. Right. Oh, by the way, as I was saying, these backdrops, these are generated by the PowerPoint designer thing. So when you type in AI Meter, this is a sort of standard backdrop, but it gets better. So next one. Oh, can you play the video? This is a short video of ChatGPT in action. So I asked her a question. I speed up at the start to correct for my human inefficiency in typing. You're a professor of physics. Explain how you would use ChatGPT and other large language models such as GPT-4 in teaching physics with a particular emphasis on EDI. and now it's back to normal speed because that's how quickly it answers the question. And if I were to sit down and just on a piece of paper plot out what are the things I think that it could help us with, this pretty much like that. There are a few other points I'll get to, but I'm not going to ask you to read all of that because I've summarized it in the next few slides. Next point at the end, while language models can be value tools, they are not perfect, etc.
Do you want me to rewind?
No, it's fine. Go on to the next one because I've just, okay, it's running it again. If you go to the next slide. Yeah. So, great thing is that if we design this or get students into the habit of using ChatGPT in a way that helps their learning, it can, coming back to the resource issue, because we've all got a finite amount of time, there's a finite amount of money, is it can be used as an interactive teaching assistant. Particularly, it would be matched to students' own pace. They can ask questions of it. They can even ask ChatGPT to come up, ChatGPT generate a list of 10 multiple choice questions on some aspect of physics. You might say, but okay, it can get it wrong, indeed, but I think we're evolving very, very quickly to a point where we're already seeing, in terms of the force inventory, force concept inventory, it's already performing at expert level. I think we're very close to this thing, maybe not infallible, but it will be pretty good. And in any case, we could then ask the student, do you agree with ChatGPT's output? If not, how would you fix it? Next one. Thank you, Olga. Now this, go back one, sorry. This I really like. Now this was subtle. So all I did was typed into the designer AI accessibility, and it comes up with this nice little sort of subtle door opening thing, which I think is pretty clever. You know, some of our undergrads did that, and tick for that, at least in terms of aesthetic sensibilities. But again, in terms of accessibility and accommodation, particularly in terms of neurodiverse students who can, you're not interacting with somebody directly, you're interacting with a chatbot, and you may well find that you're much more comfortable doing that. As I was saying at the table earlier, so I was admissions tutor for 5 years, an undergraduate admissions tutor, and the question, if you've been an admissions tutor, you know this, the question you get asked time and time again by parents is, what about small group teaching? What about small group teaching? What about small group teaching? Because that's the gold standard. Again, and I'm sure this is true for many of you, you know from small group teaching that sometimes a student in a group of 5 is absolutely terrified because the last thing they want is to be shown up in front of their peers. They sit there clammed up, you ask them a question, and you really have to be very careful in terms of how you engage them and bring them in. They are much more comfortable in a lecture theatre of 200 students. Are they learning as much in there? Well, if they're entirely uncomfortable in a one-to-one environment, maybe they are learning a heck of a lot much in that, a hell of a lot more in that much more anonymous environment. Have I gone past my time? I'm not sure. Okay. Next. So my first job in Nottingham was to revamp our second year lab to introduce a lot of interfacing. I'm an awful mathematician, but I used to be at least a decent coder, and I'm very evangelical, I would say, about the importance of embedding a lot more coding in our courses, not least because there aren't that many systems in quantum mechanics, for one, that you can solve analytically, and the three-body problem as well is not exactly that tractable. So getting computing in there is very, very important. And this may be heresy for an experimentalist to say, but actually getting students to design, for example, a lock-in amplifier at night, getting them to think about what are the principles here and how would we build that up from different units? How would we code that? And how could we have an interface? Designing that from the ground up will tell them and educate them a heck of a lot more than putting them in front of a lock-in amplifier and here's a ton of knobs. Don't touch any of those because the experiment will stop working if you touch them. So virtual lab experience is another thing we could look at. Next slide. So this is what I meant before. You type in languages, you get lots and lots of images of code. But of course, there's and it's getting better and better in terms of translation. So there's also, in terms of international students that we heard about earlier, we can bring ChatGPT in there and other large language models. Next slide. Okay, this is one thing that ChatGPT itself suggested. In principle, yes. The idea is you can feed your job adverts, you can feed your PhD adverts, your internship adverts into ChatGPT and ask it to check for the inclusivity, etc. The issue with that is, and I'm getting very close to the last slide. Next slide, please, Olga. There's also assessment. We'll just go to the very last slide. This is coupled with that idea of inclusive language. ChatGPT itself said that it and other large language models would be capable of addressing implicit bias. I think I have very many positives about these, and this is my last slide. Go to the next one, please, Olga. And the one after that. We all know this. There's been so many articles about just how much bias there is in these systems, and the idea that we can use ChatGPT to eliminate that bias is interesting, I would say. Okay, that's more than enough from me.